Welcome, nice to see you here. I'm Paul Eakins and I'm Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources and a Professor at UCL. This is one of our 3 Institute lectures which we give during the course of the year, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Yvo De Boer to give it. Yvo De Boer has had a number of extremely high-level appointments which make him almost uniquely qualified to answer this question, which I very much hope he's going to answer in the affirmative. But he tells me it's not going to be as simple as a single word answer, and I'm sure we can all understand why that is. Yvo is first of his high-level positions that I'm aware of. He was extensively involved in European Union environmental policy as Director General of the Dutch Environment Ministry, and that must have been about the time when the Dutch were world leaders in environmental policy with their National Environmental Policy Plan process. He then went on to be a Vice Chair of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development and was an advisor to the government of China and the World Bank. So he's been about a bit. He then moved to the position that I got to know him a bit in, an immensely important position between 2006 and 2010 as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it was in that position, of course, that he played a key role in the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties in 2009, which did not achieve everything that all of us would have wished, and which I'm sure he will give us some insights into this evening. Since leaving the UNFCCC, he's been at the consultancy KPMG, where he is Special Global Advisor on Climate Change and Sustainability, and heads up KPMG's international network of climate change and sustainability consulting businesses, which comprises several hundred sustainability professionals in over 60 countries. So those of us who think that it's important that business grapples with this agenda will realise the importance of that. And in 2011 he was appointed to chair the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Climate Change. So there you have it. Netherlands, European Union, UN Commission on Sustainable Development, UNFCCC, and the global business community. Yvo, you're very welcome, and we're really looking forward to what you have to say. No slides, just words, high quality words. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that for that introduction, Paul, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for saying so much about my career. I think the most exciting part of my career was definitely the climate change bit. So if you're looking for excitement in life, then I can recommend going into the climate change business. I remember at the climate change conference where we signed the Kyoto Protocol in 2007, Al Gore showing up for the final moments, and you all know that he went on to become a movie star. So there's promise for you. At the climate conference in 2007, which was in Bali, we had American battleships in front of the coast because the Indonesians had put in place this fantastic 3-layered security cordon system to protect the climate change negotiators from, I haven't the faintest idea who, but they had this fantastic 3-layer security system on land. But as all of you beachgoers know, Bali is actually on the coast. So if you haven't thought about the coast, and if Greenpeace is out there, it's better to have some protection out there as well. So they looked to the Americans for that. So we had American battleships protecting us. Then in 2009, at the climate change conference in Copenhagen, we did one better than Al Gore. We had President Obama, who I remember in the final frantic hours of that conference, continuously looking at his watch because there was a snowstorm heading towards Washington, D.C., and he had to get out of Copenhagen with Air Force One in order to land there before the snowstorm hit Washington. And in Copenhagen, we had lots of other colorful figures, some of them no longer around, like Mr. Gaddafi, Evo Morales, Ahmadinejad, Hugo Chavez. So if you're looking for excitement in life, then climate is definitely the place to go. You said I couldn't answer this question, or I wasn't going to answer this question with a single word, and I am going to answer it with a single word, and the single word is maybe. But I don't actually think this is the sort of place where you come to give a lecture, because many of you are familiar with bits and pieces of climate change. Some of you are probably quite familiar with a great deal of the international climate change agenda. So my sense is that this is more the sort of place to come and have a conversation, which is why I want to start off with some thoughts, not too long, and hope that subsequently we do have some time to get into that conversation, so that at the end of the day, I mean, my answer now might be maybe, but perhaps by the end of the evening you can convince me that the answer should be either yes or no. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think about 2 weeks ago, I was at the latest round of the International Climate Change Jamboree, which is called the Conference of Parties, amongst friends known as the COP. And this was COP19, so the 19th conference of the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. This one happened in Warsaw, and some of you may have seen on television that it started off quite dramatically. It started off, we were just off the back of a big hurricane in Asia called Haiyan, which had hit the Philippines very badly indeed. And at the beginning of that climate change conference in Warsaw, we had a very emotional opening statement from the head of the Philippine delegation, who famously broke into tears. He's not the only one that's done that in the climate change process. He broke into tears, referring to the way in which the hurricane had affected the Philippines, and basically using that to make the argument that developing countries are suffering the bulk of the impacts of climate change, which is correct, and that basically industrialized countries are not meeting their obligation under the Climate Change Convention to reduce their emissions and help developing countries like the Philippines cope with the impacts of climate change. And when he made that statement and went on that hunger strike, I must say it left me with very mixed feelings. Mixed feelings in the sense that I just left home, which is in the south of Holland, having transferred some money towards the hurricane relief effort in the Philippines, which many of you have probably done as well. So I, on the one hand, had this feeling, I've reached out to help, haven't I? And countries around the world are mobilizing resources to help places like the Philippines cope with incidents like these. And at the same time, I remembered that actually one of the most difficult countries in the climate change negotiations all along has been the Philippines. And Philippines has been one of the countries that for a variety of reasons has, I think, sometimes made the climate change process more complicated than it needs to be. But that's not really the point. The point is not whether a point was justifiably being made or not, or whether that country has been easy or difficult. I think that negotiator making that emotional statement, that negotiator bursting out in tears, that negotiator directing very strong criticism at industrialized countries, is very symptomatic for what has been happening throughout the climate change process for years. It's symptomatic of the emotion, the drama, the differences of interest that you see in that enormously complicated process. And understanding those emotions, understanding what is in the minds of people in that process is really critical if you are to understand what is happening there, and if you can even begin to answer the question on how the impasse can be broken. So let's go into those moods a little bit deeper and start perhaps with the views that you hear being expressed by many developing countries in the climate change negotiations. What you hear those countries saying after 19 conferences of parties and many other meetings that led up to the first conference of parties is that basically the international climate change process is littered with broken promises. That you see, at least in the eyes of developing countries, that in terms of finance, numerous promises have been broken. One of the core elements at the heart of the Climate Change Convention is that action by developing countries to address climate change is conditional on financial support by industrialized countries. What many developing countries feel is that that promise has not been met, that promise has been broken, that the extent to which industrialized countries are even providing financial support, it's actually by relabeling development assistance that was intended for poverty eradication towards climate change. And indeed, if you look inside the climate change architecture, you will see many bank accounts, an adaptation fund, a least developed countries fund, a special climate change fund, and a number of other funds as well, which all sound great on paper, but which actually have little or no money in them. So, broken promises in terms of finance. Secondly, also in the eyes of developing countries, and I think rightly so, broken promises in terms of technology or technology transfer. There is a strong feeling on the part of developing countries that industrialized countries should transfer the technology that they have to developing countries in order to allow them to grow their economies in a cleaner direction. And very little has happened on that front. Partly, of course, because a significant portion of that technology is actually not owned by the governments of industrialized countries. That technology is owned by the private sector, which has invested greatly in developing it and is not especially keen to transfer that technology free of charge to developing countries. But still that expectation is out there, and in the past, in order to reach a compromise, developing countries in decision language, or developed countries in decision language, have actually said, yes, we should transfer technology to developing countries, and that raises an expectation. Also, broken promises or unmet expectations in terms of capacity building, helping developing countries to actually put in place the architecture that allows them to bring about that change in direction around economic growth. So, and I won't go on too long, but basically a process in which, in the eyes of developing countries, many of the obligations that rich nations have and that form the cornerstones of both the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, that many of those promises have been broken. And here we are in a situation, at least internationally, where developing countries are now also asked to take on obligations. Developing countries are now also asked to make efforts to reduce their emissions or limit the growth of their emissions and commit to that in the context of an international treaty. One of the things that happened to draw developing countries across the line in terms of that commitment in Copenhagen was to say, okay, we will give you a green climate fund. We will give you a green climate fund Gordon Brown was actually one of the main proponents of that fund. We will give you a green climate fund that is going to mobilize $100 billion per year as of 2020 to help developing countries to engage in the context of those commitments. And what you see at this moment in time are two things. First of all, that green climate fund is not up and running. Secondly, that many industrialized countries are putting question marks around the possible effectiveness of that fund. And thirdly, that many industrialized countries are saying, well, actually, perhaps a significant portion of that 100 billion should come from the private sector rather than from the public sector, which in the eyes of developing nations creates the impression that this promise that was made is now being passed on to a private sector which wasn't part of the commitment. So in other words, we have another situation in which developing countries feel that they have been enticed into a commitment and that the things that were promised to entice them in are not being delivered. So that's part of the perception of many developing countries around the negotiating progress and the trust or distrust within that process. But that, of course, is not the entire story, in the sense that climate change is incredibly important, perhaps one of the most important issues that we're faced with in this day and age. But for many developing countries, it's not the only issue on their agenda. There are, at this moment in time, roughly 1.3 billion people in developing countries who do not have access to modern sources of energy. So how do you get 1.3 billion people who don't have any energy to reduce their emissions? There are also roughly 1.3 billion people in developing countries who are living off less than $1 a day. So basically, those people are above all interested in growing their income. And you have a vast number of developing countries, probably pretty much the whole continent of Africa, without South Africa and without Egypt, where economies are so small that their emissions are negligible in terms of the global problem, so they have very little to contribute to the solution. And then within that large family of developing countries, you have countries from the Middle East that rely for 90+% of their GDP on the exports of oil. You have small island developing nations who are about to disappear because of sea level rise. In other words, a vast mix of interest within that large group of developing countries. So in other words, there is a great deal of suspicion, significantly rightful suspicion, on the part of developing countries in terms of what is happening inside the negotiating process. And at the same time, there is an agenda outside the negotiating process which has to do with larger economic issues around economic growth and poverty eradication, which in many instances mean that climate change is not the place where you want to be focusing if you're the head of government in China or in India or in Mali, because basically you need to eradicate poverty, certainly if you want to keep your political seat. That's part of the story. Another part of the story is probably that many developing countries feel that industrialized nations have actually done very little to reduce their emissions. If you look historically, and many of you are aware that greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time, so in other words, basically what you've pumped up there since the Industrial Revolution is still significantly contributing to global warming at this moment in time. Many developing countries feel that industrialized nations have not taken responsibility for their historical emissions. They have not taken responsibility for their level of emissions today. They have not reduced their emissions significantly. And if you look at what industrialized countries have promised to do under the Kyoto Protocol, it's actually only about a 5% reduction of emissions against 1990 level. So broken promises in the negotiations, other things on the agenda, and a sense that industrialized countries are not showing leadership. And at the same time, and this goes back to the beginning of the story about the head of delegation from the Philippines, we're in the situation where climate change impacts are beginning to be felt around the world, and especially in developing countries. that are least able to protect themselves against the impacts of climate change. So on top of everything that I've said, you have a large number of developing countries that feel that they have been cynically abandoned in terms of the impacts that are affecting them. That, in a nutshell, maybe a coconut shell, is a bit of the story from a developing country perspective. But there are also many concerns on the part of industrialized countries in terms of what is happening in the process. Many industrialized countries feel, and you've heard politicians from the UK, the United States, from Europe say this, that many developing countries are playing games in the negotiations. That major developing countries like China and India are basically hiding behind smaller developing countries in an attempt to avoid having to take on obligations themselves. Many industrialized countries feel that the institutions within the climate change negotiations are basically not functioning, that the process is too complicated, and that actually this is a time when all countries should be taking on obligations. China has overtaken the United States to become the largest emitter in the world. You hear Brazil talking about historic responsibility a great deal, but if you were to move on 10 years and then look at what historic responsibility is at that moment in time, you would actually find that China by then has a very significant historic responsibility. So industrialized nations feel that developing countries, especially larger developing countries, are playing games in the process, that they're stalling the process, that they're throwing sand into the machine, basically with the purpose of not having to take on commitments themselves, when the only way in which we can address climate change, the only way we can come to a yes answer on that question, is actually for all nations to engage and for all nations to take responsibility in terms of reducing their emissions. So those are some of the feelings from developing countries and developed countries in terms of the issues and how they look at each other. But where do they actually look at each other? Where they look at each other is an incredibly complicated climate change negotiating process. What you have are a COP, a MOP, a SUBSTA, an SBI, and an ADB. So you have the COP, which is the Conference of Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. You have the CMP, which is the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. Both of those two bodies have a subsidiary body on implementation. Both of those two bodies have a subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice. The convention has created a special body to negotiate future commitment, which is called the ADB. All of those bodies are meeting at the same moment in time for 2 weeks a year. They've just completed that in Warsaw. Since the agenda is so massive, they're doing all of that negotiating under all of those bodies in a series of subgroups, which they call contact groups, which are also all meeting at the same moment in time. Within those contact groups and subgroups and the SUBSTA and the SBI and the COP and the CMP and the ADB, everything is related to everything else because this is a negotiating process. So it's very difficult to make progress in one body on one item of the agenda if you don't know what's going to be happening somewhere else. And that's all well and good if you're an American or a Brazilian who can afford to come to a conference like that with 600 or 800 people on your delegation. It becomes slightly more complex if you're representing Mali or Niger or Tuvalu and you've got 2 people on your delegation and you're trying to cover exactly the same agenda. So in other words, all of the suspicion and the broken promises and the differences of opinion aside, you've got this incredible bureaucracy out there where everything is related to everything else. And that has some cynical consequences, including a significant number, a growing number of people who actually make their living out of this process, people who might in their home capital be on a salary of $100 a month, if they're lucky, and who within these climate negotiations are getting a daily allowance of $100 a day in order to be present and participate in the negotiations. And some of those people are actually in the negotiations 6 to 9 months of the year. So you have people that perhaps cynically want to keep the process alive because it's become a way of living. But you also have people, like perhaps the representative of Mali or Niger or Tuvalu, who is saying, wait a minute, what am I missing over there? And let's not make too much progress over here until I found out what's going on over there, so that I can make sure with my delegation of 2 that I have the same degree of control and understanding as the country that has 800 people on the delegation. And on top of that comes the fact that in this process that is so incredibly political, the politicians are largely absent. The meetings, these big meetings, happen basically once a year for 2 weeks, late November, early December. And what you see is that ministers arrive towards the end of that meeting for a so-called high-level segment which lasts for 3 days and then shed light on the process and give instructions to the negotiators, which is actually very little time for them to understand the process. It's very little time for them to interact. It's very little time for them to get to know each other. And it's very little time for them to give guidance to a process which is so vital. And bear in mind that all of this has basically been going on since Rio in 1992. 19 conferences of parties and many preparatory sessions before that. Time for a question. Is there anybody in the room that is now not totally depressed? Okay, good. Well, not so good. To maybe lift things up a bit, there has also been progress in the negotiations. It's been coming along very slowly. In 1997, we had an agreement around the Kyoto Protocol, which may not have meant a great deal in terms of reducing emissions, just that 4 or 5% emission reduction on the part of industrialized countries. But it was very significant in terms of putting an architecture in place, writing rules around how countries are supposed to report on their emissions, how those emission levels are going to be checked, whether you have market-based mechanisms in place, which greenhouse gases you're going to focus on. Are forests and agriculture going to be part of the system or not? What can you measure? In other words, although Kyoto might not have been significant in terms of the emission reduction targets, it did put some pretty important basic infrastructure in place. And after Kyoto, we basically had that long build-up to the climate change conference in 2009. You referred to it. Great hopes and expectations around the world in terms of what Copenhagen was going to deliver. And I actually remember being here in London just a couple of months, I think it must have been September, before that big climate change conference in Copenhagen. And I did an interview with Fiona Harvey, who at that time was still working for the Financial Times. And in the interview I said, Copenhagen is not going to deliver a new international treaty. And that was suddenly headlines around the world, because many people, perhaps some of you, were expecting a new international treaty to come out of Copenhagen. And my view was, bureaucratically, legally, that was not going to happen because the preparations for that kind of an agreement had not been made. Basically, the world, in a legal sense, in a negotiating sense, in a political sense, was not ready for an international treaty, including some very important things that go back to national politics in the United States that I don't have time to go into now, but that you might want to raise later. The question then is, and you didn't say it, Paul, was Copenhagen a complete and an utter failure? I think it was a complete and utter failure for all of the people that expected a new international treaty that would rise to the challenge of climate change. I do think that, like Kyoto, it put some basic stuff in place. The first thing it put in place, and this is not insignificant, I think, is that countries agreed there that we need to maximize average global temperature increase at 2 degrees centigrade as compared to pre-industrial levels. And that goes back to a whole lot of things around how fast can ecosystems adapt, how much sea level rise are you willing to tolerate. In other words, there was a political sense that maybe a 2 degrees centigrade increase is the maximum we should accept as humanity in terms of the impacts that go with that and the impacts that go with anything beyond a 2 degree temperature increase. And it also put in place some other agreements, the launch of that Green Climate Fund, the agreement that in future all countries should engage in terms of limiting or reducing their emissions. So some important stepping stones that we can build on moving towards the future. But not that strong, resounding response to the challenge of climate change. And that is in and of itself surprising. Surprising in the sense that when I started working on climate change first in the early 90s, there was an early report out from the international scientific community, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They just brought out their second assessment report in 1994. And that report had in it an incredibly carefully formulated sentence, the kind of sentence that only a scientist can write. And the sentence was, the balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence in terms of climate change. So the balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence in terms of climate change. That was the understanding of climate science in 1994. And look at where we are today, with basically the scientific community now with their fifth assessment report saying, we're sure. It's you guys that are causing this, and it's you guys that need to fix it. But not that strong, not the strong response that you would expect to a message so clear. What surprises me even more is that there are so many other messages out there which don't seem to resonate either. Yes, climate change is an issue, but for many countries there are issues around energy prices, around energy security, around water, which I expect to be the biggest challenge over the coming decades, around shortages of food, around material scarcity and material prices. I remember speaking to a bunch of oil people in Dallas, Texas, not all that long ago, and I had the questionable honor of being the speaker immediately after Dick Cheney. So I thought, what the hell am I going to say here without people starting to throw furniture at me? Fortunately, your chairs are fixed to the floor. So I said that I just received a message from the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who had told me that he had actually been reading all his charts upside down, and that global temperature was going down, not up, and that we had nothing to worry about. So all of the Texans in the room looked really happy at that message. And then I asked them the question, even if that were true, would it make the least bit of difference? Because all of those issues around energy, water, food, and the rest of them are basically driving us in the same direction. And actually, if you look at the nexus between climate, energy, food, and water, many of the things that we need to do and that we should be doing to address some of those non-climate issues are actually the same things that you ought to be doing, that you need to be doing in order to address climate change. So aren't we actually missing a massive opportunity to grab a whole bunch of global issues together and work towards a solution? And that's not happening. That's not happening at this moment in time. So the question then, maybe to go back a little bit to climate, or climate and the broader conversation, is why is that not happening? Why isn't there that focus at this moment in time on climate? And why isn't there that focus on that broader set of issues that I referred to? And there's a number of reasons for that, and I think we need to be aware of those reasons if we're going to find the answer to that question on the policy impasse. The first is that I think many politicians are still in the middle of an incredible Copenhagen hangover, in the sense that 80 heads of state and government came to Copenhagen. 80 heads of state and government expected to walk away from Copenhagen with something that was going to make them incredibly popular back home. In fact, some politicians like Kevin Rudd even pretended that something incredibly good had come out of Copenhagen and subsequently lost his job. But many of those politicians have the feeling, I'm not going there again. Once bitten, twice shy, that was a disaster. I don't believe in that process anymore. So the climate change hangover. The second very significant reason why we're not seeing progress is, I think, because of an economic crisis, a financial crisis, and for some of us, a Eurozone crisis that came immediately after Copenhagen, crises which basically are not over. If you ask me who is one of your favorite politicians, I would say German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Because I think she has done throughout her career incredible things for climate, for sustainability, for East Germans, for a whole bunch of stuff. And she was actually Germany's environment minister in Kyoto in 1997. She's one of the people, or she is the person that broadened the G8, which has become largely irrelevant, into the G20. She is the one that basically got Europe onto a unified position in the run-up to Copenhagen. And speaking in terms of things that consist of one word, I think Angela Merkel's vocabulary has been reduced to one word. Anybody know what word that is? The word is Greece. That is all that she and many European politicians have been talking about in recent months. So you've got the Copenhagen hangover. People are sick of the process. You've got the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and basically all politicians focusing on that. You have many developing countries who are feeling the consequences of that economic crisis in the West and seeing their economic growth decline or the growth rate slow. Their primary preoccupation is with economic growth and poverty eradication, so they're really happy that the Europeans are not beating the climate drum and harassing them about commitments. I think people have lost significantly their connection to climate change as an issue, and perhaps even to the environment as an issue. I mean, to what extent do you still feel you have control over what happens around environmental issues? In my country, we've just found out, my country is Holland, we've just found out that being good, obedient environment lovers, we put our garbage, or our rubbish, I think you call it here, by the side of the road, glass, metal, green stuff, only to discover that at the collection site it's all thrown together again because recycling centrally is easy. And that really disconnects you, I think, from environmental issues. I think that many people nowadays feel that that climate politics is only about politics. It's about people pointing fingers at each other. China pointing a finger at the United States at China. More and more people in Europe saying we can't take on a commitment if major developing countries don't do the same. So I think a popular distance from the issues in terms of the people that should actually, you people, that should be driving the politicians in the right direction. Because actually, you don't need to go to university to become a politician. Being a politician is the easiest possible thing in life. The only thing that you need in order to be a really successful politician is followers. And if you and I as followers don't push the politicians in a certain direction, then the politicians won't move. And that, I think, is the situation that we're in at this moment in time. So that's where we are at the moment. Now back again to the climate change process. That had that dip immediately after Copenhagen, the hangover and the economic crisis. But at the same time, you saw that people within the process were trying to rebuild things, to reconstruct the ruins from Copenhagen, and to get the process moving again. So after Copenhagen, a couple of years after Copenhagen, we had a very promising conference in Durban in South Africa, where it was basically agreed that in 2015, wait for it, in 2015, we need this big new global agreement which is going to address climate change, in the context of which all countries will take commitments. In the context of which all countries will make contributions. We will have that agreement in 2015, and it's supposed to enter into force in 2020. And that, seriously, I think, is a very important moment, because it provides us with a landmark. It provides us with the next moment when, if you're up to it, if you're interested, you can hold the politicians accountable, not in terms of how good they are at pointing fingers at each other, but how good they are at actually doing something about the issue. And then we had, just a couple of weeks ago, that conference of parties in Warsaw, in Poland, which was really exciting as well. Poland, as you know, has not been one of the easiest countries within the European Union, at least in the eyes of the rest of the European Union. In the eyes of Poland, it's the rest of the European Union which has been incredibly difficult. So the truth is all in the eye of the beholder. The fact of the matter is that Poland relies for 96% of its power generation on coal. It's very difficult for them to get off coal without incurring significant cost, and having all of the Europeans browbeating them doesn't really help. Doesn't help when you're having a fight at home either. But nonetheless, the Poles offered to host this conference and came up with a number of important outcomes. The first important outcome that Poland came with is a roadmap in terms of how negotiations are supposed to be conducted in order to take us to that agreement in 2015. So you now at least, or we have at least now something against which you can, against which you can track progress or non-progress in the negotiations. I don't know why I'm shouting when I've got a microphone on, but anyway. The second thing that Warsaw came up with, and they stayed up the whole of Saturday night or the whole of Friday night and most of Saturday morning in order to come to that conclusion. The other thing that Warsaw decided is that early in 2015 we should have indications from countries in terms of what their contributions are going to be, not commitments, but their contributions are going to be towards that 2015 agreement, which is supposed to enter into force in 2020 and which is supposed to save us from a more than 2-degree temperature increase. Now, why is that significant? That's significant because it means that as of early 2015, countries will be able to compare the effort that they're willing to make with the efforts of others. They'll be able to enter into a conversation with each other about, why aren't you doing a bit more, Paul? Come on, I'm sure you could up the ante a bit. Why can we introduce more flexibility into the system to increase the level of ambition? In other words, the mechanism will be there that will allow countries to compare efforts with each other, and that is incredibly important, because you can be negative about finger pointing, but you could also say that in this day and age, it is actually incredibly important to have a sense that each and every country is pulling its weight, that all nations, to the extent of their ability, are doing something to address climate change. So those, I think, are two incredibly important outcomes of Warsaw. But bear in mind that the fundamental differences are still out there. So if we've got some positive outcomes, but the fundamental differences are still out there, what is going to reset the spirit in the negotiations? What needs to happen? Is it a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Is it some other mechanism that's going to wipe the memory, all the horrible memories of the people inside the process, and allow them openly to focus on how to break the climate impasse? In other words, what are the key elements of a successful outcome in 2015? And there are, I think, 4 main elements. And I'll run across them very quickly. The first main element is that we absolutely have to see leadership by industrialized countries. Industrialized countries have caused this problem. Industrialized countries have the economic wherewithal to cope with this problem. Industrialized countries, at least to my mind, have a responsibility to lead, and to lead by example. So that's one. The second point is that we have to see engagement by major developing countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, etc. Because our global economy has become so intertwined that you can't have significant action on climate change in one place without having significant action on climate change action in another place. I remember quite a long time ago being in New York with a number of European politicians and trying to explain the American obsession around China. And I said to the politicians that I was having lunch with, the problem in this country, in the United States, is that if you turn anything over, it says made in China underneath. And I turned over my plate and it said made in China underneath. So in other words, in this day and age, it is very, very difficult for the US to act if China is not, for China to act if the United States is not, for China to act if Europe is not, because the Chinese are largely making stuff for Americans and Europeans. In other words, we need to see as a second point that major developing country engagement. The third thing which I think we need to see is a clear and measurable commitment, a verifiable commitment in terms of finance and the mobilization, not the transfer, but the mobilization of technology. Helping developing countries, poorer developing countries, to engage through finance, through capacity building, is a cornerstone of the convention, and I think that cornerstone needs to be respected. And the fourth thing I think we need in 2015 is an agreement on how the adequacy of whatever is agreed in 2015 is going to be reviewed. I'm a great believer in politicians, in negotiators, in all of us, because we're really going to give the politicians a tough time in the run-up to 2015 and make sure that they deliver. But even if we put them under the maximum amount of pressure, I do not think that that agreement in 2015 is going to save us from a 2-degree temperature increase. I think that there will be more steps in the process, and therefore we need a mechanism to regularly review the adequacy of commitments and the adequacy of the implementation of commitments. So those are my 4 very sort of high-level key elements for a 2015 agreement. The question then is how do you get to that agreement? I described earlier on the incredible complexity of the climate change negotiations. 197 countries are at the table in those negotiations. I made an unbelievable number of enemies at the climate change conference in Copenhagen, which was at an incredibly cold time of the year. And there were queues of people, some of them queuing 8 hours out there in the freezing cold, trying to get into the conference center. And the reason they were queuing outside was because I was told by the fire department that I could only allow 15,000 people into the conference center, and there were 45,000 people trying to get in. So if you've got 197 countries at the table, the COP, the MOP, the CMP, the ADP, and all the contact groups and everything happening at the same moment in time, how on earth do you bring that kind of a complex thing to a successful conclusion around 4 issues? And that requires, I think, leadership. That conference in 2015 is going to happen in Paris, in France, at Le Bourget. Probably in an empty hangar. I hope a big one. So what are the French going to do to show leadership on that process and to take us to a good result? I hope they start with that early, and I hope that they do that by engaging a core group of leaders, a bit like getting the key animals onto Noah's Ark. So you need somebody from an industrialized country, from a big emerging economy, somebody from a small island state, somebody from a least developed country, somebody from an oil-producing nation. In other words, you need a balance of key leaders from maybe 30 to 40 countries that you feel adequately represent all of the different views and interests in this process. And I think that that is important because you cannot come to a meaningful result by being dismissive of the interests of some people. You can decide that you want to dismiss the interests of oil-producing nations because you see them as part of the cause of this problem. But these are people, as I said earlier on, who for 90+% of their GDP rely on oil as the driving force of their economy. In other words, if you don't find a way to help them to become part of the solution, I can assure you that they're going to be part of the problem. In other words, you need a core group which is representative, at least to my mind, of the different interests. And you need, I think, to get that core group working early. Can that work? I think so. I think probably the 14 most fascinating hours of my life were spent in the final hours of that Copenhagen climate change conference with Obama and Merkel and then President Lula from Brazil and Sarkozy and Barroso and Nasheed from the Maldives, removed again. So really that India was there, China was there. So really, I think that core group of representative countries. And I saw those people have an amazing conversation around the table. That conversation was not about pointing fingers at each other. This was a group of humans trying to find a solution to a human issue. Perhaps my biggest shortcoming in life was that I was not able to put the right solution on the table for them at that moment in time. And my sincere hope is that President Hollande gets it right, that he mobilizes that group early, and that he can put the right solution on the table at the right moment in time. Having said that, I think that even with all the imaginable effort, with all the imaginable prodding and pushing from you as voters, with all of the effort in the world, I think two critical challenges remain. The first critical challenge is, how can you frame the climate change challenge, the climate change agenda, and the climate change opportunity in the context of a broader story around economic growth, sustainable growth, and green growth? I personally do not believe that we have seen the back end of the economic crisis. I think we're still in the middle of it. If I look at most politicians in Europe and many politicians in the United States, I see those politicians looking for solutions to future challenges in the past. The debate certainly in mainland Europe is about, shouldn't we be going back to manufacturing, because that's made the Germans so successful? Shouldn't we be lowering energy prices to enhance our competitiveness? That's Europe. Stories in the US are comparable. Concerns in many parts of Asia are similar. If you look at where the fastest economic growth is happening at this moment in time, it's in places like Angola and Timor-Leste, places where the concern is drill, baby, drill, and we'll worry about the environment later. So in other words, we have to find a way of combining the climate change narrative with the broader economic narrative. That's the first challenge that we face. And the second challenge that we face is a logistical one. The second challenge that we face is, where do you have that conversation? Do you have that conversation at the UN FCCC, in the COP or the MOP or the CMP or the SUBSTA or the SBI or the ADP, with 197 countries at the table? Maybe. Do you have that conversation in the WTO, which is basically broken? Do you have that conversation in the G8, which is either past tense or past imperfect? So where do you have that political conversation? My sense is that if France, if President Hollande, with a great deal of help, can start early to concentrate that core group of leaders in an informal setting to craft the economic argument for an agenda on climate change in the context of a broader narrative around green growth that can help us to cope with climate, with energy security, with food, with water, with ecosystems, with material prices, with biodiversity loss, in the context of everything that we're doing to have babies and make them richer, then possibly the answer to the question that's gone could be yes. Thank you.
So I'm going to just say a few things by way of starting the conversation with you, and we'll then broaden it out before coming back to Yvo. I want to thank you first of all for starting off with the developing country perspective, because we don't get that very often, even in our so-called enlightened newspapers. I think you put it very fairly and very well, the enormous sense of outrage and betrayal which will be being felt by many developing countries about the way that this 20-year process has unfolded. And I think it was quite extraordinary that the Warsaw COP should have been in the wake of the hurricane in the Philippines as a kind of realization of the worst sort of things that the climate scientists have been warning that we will have to prepare for. And yet, of course, we know that that's not the worst. That's the beginning. And for those of us who've been working at this for some time, and I haven't been working at it for anything like as long or as committedly as you have, I mean, Tacloban was a real sense of failure, in the sense that that was precisely the kind of image that people like me had been hoping we would be able to avoid, but we haven't managed it. Thank you also for bringing to mind that the climate is just one part of this nexus, as it is now called, and all those other issues. That, of course, is an absolutely fundamental insight behind the very small institute that I direct here at UCL, the Institute for Sustainable Resources, quite determinedly broadening out from the energy and climate subject, which is the subject of our older sister institute, the UCL Energy Institute, in order to embrace these other issues that you talked about. You only mentioned once something which in my lectures on these subjects I've in the past thought might be more influential than it has been, and that really dates back to the time when Tony Blair first put on the agenda of the G20 the climate change issue. They've been blown apart by the financial, or blown off that course by the financial crisis, but I still think that that could be a forum in which much of the preparatory work for the COPs was prepared, and that's a body that accounts for some 80% of the world's emissions, I think, and one would have thought if they could come to a rather easier agreement among 20, that an agreement among the 197 might become a little easier. So I'd like you to comment a bit on that. I'd like you to comment on the issue to do with targets and commitments. Kyoto, of course, was framed in the terms of target and commitments, many of which have been more honoured in the breach than the observance. And there have been more or less influential papers around that have suggested that actually that's not the right way of looking at it. If it isn't the right way of looking at it, what might be the right way of looking at it? I mean, might we do better just to focus on technologies, for example? I'd like you to comment on your question of why is the response not there. Well, in the climate change issue, one of the issues that I've been focusing on a bit with some of my researchers is the issue of the unburnable carbon, and you will know that phrase from various publications. There's something like $20 trillion in stock market value that is unburnable if we are to meet the 2 degrees target. And if you're the owner of that stock, or the manager of companies whose stock is underwritten by that sort of value, you can afford to spend quite a lot of money on confusing the issue and ensure that there isn't an appropriate response. How important is that in the business world in which you're now moving? And are there alternative business mobilizations in response to that? And perhaps the last thing I'll say is this enormous paradox that came out of the language that you used about leaders and followers. Politicians are followers, you said. And of course that's true in the sense that in democratic countries at least they only stay in power for as long as we allow them to. And certainly when one looks at the political responses to things like energy bills, that's not being driven very strongly by concerns on climate change just now in this country. And yet you referred to these politicians who are going to have to come together under President Hollande's wing as leaders. And these were the people who were actually going to form the agreement and ensure that the Paris COP can have a success and an outcome that the Copenhagen COP did not. So I'd just like you to reflect a bit about that on the politics. One of the most impressive people I've heard on a public platform on this subject recently is Bill McKibben, who is one of the people behind the 350.org popular mobilization in the United States and indeed worldwide. He, of course, would deny vehemently being a leader of such an organization because he doesn't believe in that, but nevertheless his sensitivities on that and modesty on that apart, I think one can think of him as a leader of that in perceiving that without some kind of global mobilization of the popular will, these leaders, followers, are not going to get the necessary mandate to do what needs to be done at Paris or anywhere else. So there are a few random thoughts stirred by the very wise words that you've honoured us with tonight. Before you respond to them, perhaps we could just have one or two other contributions from the large number of people here, and there are lots of hands, of course.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden, looking at how to launch an ecosystem bond in the city, and the evidence is that there's not the slightest interest in the city in terms of share prices to do with climate change. I'm finding it incredibly difficult to make headway against this massive wall of money, $98 trillion bond market with 0.3% in the green bond area. What hope is there unless the city can shift into this space?
Nadia Schweimer from the Climate and Knowledge Development Network.
Thank you.
You mentioned how politicians are quite shy of the process, especially given their negative experience coming out of COP15 and coming up to the Leaders Summit now next September. How do you think that might have changed in terms of the political landscape, and what can we do to help push our leaders, as you said, to be in a better position, particularly developing countries? What role do we have to play to push leaders from major countries to...
It's Mark Jolly, Professor of Sustainable Manufacturing from Cranfield University. I wondered whether you would like to comment. You mentioned growth. Do we need to have growth? What's your opinion about growth generally? One comment. And the other is...
Nice easy one to start with, okay.
Yeah. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, whether you've come across that in the circular economy.
Your point on how do you push politicians, my rephrasing of what you said, I think by keeping it simple. One of the big problems with Copenhagen, to my mind, is that it was not clear what people wanted Copenhagen to deliver. I just mentioned 4 points for 2015. Preferably, you should reduce that to 3, not 4. They can be those 4 or those 3, or you can have 3 or others. But please try and reach a civil society consensus on what those 3 points need to be, what Paris needs to deliver, and then stick a microphone in the face of each and every politician that you come to and say, are you willing to sign up to those 3 points? Are you willing to contribute to that consensus? Because at the moment it's not clear, and it wasn't clear in the run-up to Copenhagen. So even if you manage to find the politician and stick the microphone in his or her face, you don't know what to ask them because it's not clear what it's supposed to deliver. So I said there were 197 countries in the negotiations. There are probably 197,000 non-governmental organizations in the negotiations. So getting them onto the same page is perhaps even more difficult. But there has to be that shared perception of what constitutes success. And I'd be really careful not to set the bar too high, not to set it too low either, but to define your 3 points in terms of things that can realistically be achieved, that are good enough that you can get public opinion behind and get that message resonating around the world, including through the organization that you referred to. There is this man, at least I think it's a man, who's developed he's a professor, or who's developed a a curve that's called after him about the diminishing pleasure resulting from wealth. I don't remember what the curve is or who the professor is. And I think that okay, good. Well, I'm sure lots of people are Googling him now, but is he a he or is he a she? Okay, two of them. Okay. And people, certainly in mainland Europe, are getting really excited about that. And I think it's a wonderful concept if you're earning $100,000 a year or more. If you're on $100 a year, it's slightly more complicated. So, I mean, I remember that in the run-up to Rio, Gro Harlem Brundtland, together with a bunch of other people, wrote a report, generally known as the Brundtland Report, or Our Common Future, it was also called, I think. And in the context of that report, they were talking about 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps were people, that one's still there, planet, that one's still there, and the 3rd P was prosperity. And somewhere, I don't know where, but that 3rd P on prosperity got translated into profit. So now everybody talks about the 3 Ps as being people, planet, and profit. I think we need to get back to the prosperity P. But that prosperity P does not mean leaving 1.3 billion people without electricity on $1 a day. It means finding a different way of creating well-being. So that
my point was, do we need growth in the developed world rather than, yes, we need growth in the non-developed world, but do we need growth so much? We still, politicians go for growth in the developed world. We should change our economics.
I think you still need growth in the developed world, but I think you need a different kind of growth. So I don't think the growth is necessarily about making more stuff. Yeah. It's about, I mean, what is the point if you've got a stomach ache of going to a general practitioner who hasn't read a book for years, who'd rather be out playing golf, when you could be consulting a computer terminal that's got all the medical literature in human history behind it. So, you know, what can we do in the West with all of our knowledge on medical science, on ICT, to reform healthcare systems and cope with all the old people and make that a new way of doing business, of creating prosperity in Europe. So I think we need to create the prosperity more intelligently than we're doing at the moment. To take the bonds issue and all of yours together, I think that shouldn't really say this, but the one thing that most fund managers and most goldfish have in common is an attention span of about 30 seconds. So if you go onto the financial markets, you will see a whole lot of incredibly motivated, enthusiastic people who care a lot about all the important things in life, but they're being rewarded in terms of their performance over the next 6 months. So they are in fact actively discouraged from looking further into time. And this is getting a bit techie, but when we thought that maybe financial institutions, pension funds, banks might be interested in long-term investments which could be more sustainable, we invented something called Basel III, which actually prevents from financial institutions from taking that longer-term perspective. So basically, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why you're not able to find a place for your green bonds in the market, but one of them is that the investment community has this incredible short-term focus, and unless we manage to change that, and I think we need to change that in the context of a broad approach on all of those issues, it's going to be very difficult to get the investment community to take a different focus. Although things are changing, it wasn't all that long ago that 100% of the value of a company was determined by the assets that company held. Now about 80% of the value of a company is determined by things that we used to call non-financial, by things that relate to the reputation of the company, how they treat their workers, how their supply chain is structured, whether there is a sense that there is a future for this company in the marketplace. So one of the challenges that we face is how, in the context of the valuation of commercial assets, can we bring in some of that stuff that we used to call non-financial or immaterial. And I'm going to go quickly to the other points because there's probably more people that want to say something. The stranded assets, all of the oil and the coal that's in the ground. There was a fantastic conference here in London in 1896. And it was a conference of urban planners, and they concluded that the big urban issue of the 20th century was going to be horseshit. Because everyone was getting wealthier and wealthier and buying horses and buying carriages and horses to pull the carriages, and the fear was that London was going to be a yard deep in horse manure. And along came the internal combustion engine. So that issue was solved. I don't know what the next big technological fix is going to be. But I do think we are almost... I've always thought that climate is the easiest issue in the world to address, because all you need to do is to... How do I do this the right way around? You need to push the price of fossil fuels up to reflect their environmental cost. And you need to push the price of renewables down through research and development, and when those two lines cross, climate problem fixed. It's that easy. The question though is how can you make all of these people that have all of these potentially stranded assets part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem, in the same way that you want to make oil-producing countries part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think the way to do that is to put a price on carbon, which we need to do anyway. We should put a price on carbon and on water and on ecosystems. If food producers today had to internalize the environmental cost of how they do business, they would see their profits wiped out twice over. If industry around the world were to internalize environmental costs, they would see their profits drop by 40%. In other words, we are leaving the bulk of environmental cost outside the price of the stuff that you and I buy. And the challenge that we face is to internalize that cost through pricing. And if we do that, if you create, amongst other things, a price on carbon, then many of the people with these stranded assets can become part of the solution, including through things like carbon and capture and storage, which is why you need targets, because without targets, without quantified commitments, you can't create a scarcity in the marketplace that actually puts the price on carbon. What is potentially the role of the G20 in that? I think a very significant one, because as you said, they account for about 80% of emissions. But the Maldives, Mali, are not members of the G20. So if you feel that the solution to this problem is about more than reducing emissions, if you feel that the solution to this issue is also about adapting to the impacts of climate change, changing the model for economic growth in developing countries, then the agenda has to be broader. So I think you can make very significant progress in the G20 on emission reductions. But if you want to do justice to the issue as a whole, you need to take that G20 solution to other places as well.
Let's start at the front here, because I haven't gone at the front. Yeah.
Anders Lorentzen, environmental blogger. You could talk a bit about the green growth and green economy, and I think we can all agree that the carbon legislation and carbon tax will push fossil fuel price up, so we become cheaper. But it is actually, without that, renewables in some places in the world are actually quite close to reaching grid parity, where it becomes almost evenly priced as fossil fuels. Like, I think even in climate skeptic Australia, you have wind power in one state that's the cheapest form of electricity. Some parts of India, all the developing world, solar power is now getting the cheapest form of energy. And also in terms of on the developing front, if you want, you're talking about developing African countries, you can get those countries that doesn't have access to grids and stuff like that. What we're seeing now, they get that development increases because they can get solar power and and stuff like that. And I just wondered what your take on it in terms of the green growth, if that could explode in terms of what we're seeing now.
Okay, thank you very much. So going back to the lady there, I'm going to go gentleman, lady, insofar as I can. So,
Kieran Sir, I'm also part of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. Ban Ki-moon's Leader Summit next year is one of the key meetings of senior political figures on climate change. What do you think Ban Ki-moon's strategy should be for that meeting to help us on the road to 2015 to Paris and getting a global agreement? Should it be to put pressure on the basics? Should it be to shame the industrialized nations into committing to contributions? Because the developing countries are showing some climate leadership. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
okay, Ban Ki-moon's strategy. Let's go to a gentleman here.
My name is Peter Kirby-Harris from Green Economics Institute in Reading. What role do you see in the sort of sub-state political actors playing, particularly mayors, cities, business federations, the labour movement? Is this a positive step, or would this be a distraction?
Thank you very much for that one. The lady there.
Is there anything to expect from Lima's COP?
From Lima? Okay.
Can you say that again?
COP in Lima, the next conference.
Oh, right,
in,
Lima's COP. Right. Do you have an interest in that?
I'm Peruvian.
You're Peruvian. I wondered if you might be. There's a gentleman at the front here.
Alex Boyer from the School of Construction and Project Management in Bartlett. I think I know the answer to this already, but I just wanted to mention in the past few months we've seen the passing of one of the most influential economists, Ronald Coase, died at the fine age of 102. And I just wanted an insight as to how applicable you think his theories are for the internalisation of these externalities in terms of climate change, and where are the areas where that doesn't work. And maybe just a quick...
Why don't you tell us what his theories are, just so I can pretend that I know.
No, we can't. We're not going to go into that. Otherwise...
Always the economist. Well, maybe just a
I'll
quick
tell you over
review
dinner.
Of emissions trading schemes. So the idea that you know, as an example...
Views on the emissions trading scheme, we can easily cope with that. Is there another lady who'd like to ask a question? Don't be shy. Yes.
I'm here, I'm from Bristol, and we've got the bid for 2015 Green Capital. And I was just wondering how important sort of local level engagement is, and whether you think sort of, say, Bristol twinning with maybe somewhere in Ghana or developing countries, how important that might be.
Well, maybe to start with the twinning and the subnational. I personally don't think if Bristol twins with Accra, it's going to be particularly useful for Bristol, or to Accra for that matter, because they're so incredibly different. So I think that doesn't mean that I do not believe it's important for rich country cities to work together with developing country partners. I think it is, but I think it's more in the context of helping them to find solutions that are appropriate to them, rather than thinking that the solutions that you've developed for yourself are going to be appropriate for them as well, or the other way around. I do think, and this goes to the point on the subnational level, that whereas national politicians seem to be paralyzed, there's an amazing amount happening at the level of cities and regions. I mean, look at what former Mayor Bloomberg did in New York. You have something called the C40, which is an association of 40 cities. Then you've got something which is the R20, which is an association of 20 regions. So you really see that that cities are beginning to address these issues. They don't have to come to these massive conferences. They're doing real stuff because they're confronted with real issues that affect real people, and they're really close to those real people, which many of the national politicians are not. So I think subnational level action is really important. When you started talking about wind, that reminded me that I hadn't not properly responded to the question on green growth and the circular economy. I think green growth and the circular economy is basically the direction in which we need to go, in the sense that, not just mainland Europe, your bit of Europe as well, is incredibly resource poor, but can become incredibly resource rich if we were to become better at recycling. And I'm fascinated in my day job talking to people that manage rubbish collection companies, that are talking to manufacturers about how they can make stuff so that you can take it apart more easily once you and I are done with it. So that's definitely the direction to go. I also think that in reality we're past the tipping point. I think in most parts of if you were to look at costs properly, that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel generated power in many instances, if you look at that broader environmental cost. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face on renewables and in developing countries is how can you create innovative finance schemes, in the sense that most people in slums, in poor areas in developing countries, are paying more for water and fuel than you are, because they're buying it on a daily basis by the litre or the pint. But they can't afford a solar panel. So, because they don't have a savings account with that amount of money in it. So can you find ways of paying for that solar panel up front, but then getting them to pay the cost of that back over a longer period, because they don't have to buy the expensive fuel anymore by the litre? So how can you create innovative financing schemes? Ban Ki-moon's summit, well, he could probably use some really good advice at the moment, because his plan was to have that summit in September of 2014 focus on commitments that countries and business leaders were willing to make. And Warsaw threw a major spanner into that plan, because there's now talk about announcing contributions in 2015. And as you know, 2015 comes after 2014. So he's got a bit of a problem. My suggestion, I talked about those 4 points, which you could replace by any 4 others, is to get those well-intentioned people to have a really good conversation about what are the 3 or 4 issues that for them would define success in 2015. And then not to sort of come with the typical national interest rhetoric about we want compensation for this or we want that, but to really say what for humanity as a whole is the essence of that agreement. Is it rich country leadership, or what does that mean? Is it developing country engagement? What would that mean? How can we finally do something real on finance instead of just talking about it? So focus on the key political issues that would need to be agreed in 2015. And Lima is going to be incredibly important, because Warsaw agreed a negotiating agenda for the coming 2 years, and in Lima it's going to be the first time that a real negotiating text is on the table. So the language that is supposed to be agreed in Paris in 2015 will be on the table for the first time in Lima in 2014. So that basically means that you will have your first opportunity to say this measures up, this doesn't measure up, this is what is missing. Local community engagement is missing. A strong focus on the construction sector is missing. The notion of the circular economy is missing. So that'll really be the first opportunity to take stock of what's on the table then.
Thank you very much. Down at the front here.
Jeremy Richardson from URS Consultants. On the way here today, I was reading the Standard and I heard that David Cameron, who's over in China at the moment, had secured some sort of agreement from the Chinese that they were going to fund a new high-speed rail scheme in the UK. Now, as a bit of background, this high-speed rail is very controversial. It has been said in the past...
I think there's a KPMG report that says it's a really good idea.
That's absolutely one, yes, exactly.
Okay, we got the same bit of rail.
Yes, that's right, it's exactly the same one. Now, this has been said in the past to be low carbon, and there are different arguments, and so let's, for the sake of this argument, say it is low carbon. Going back to this thing about climate finance, here we haven't got an industrialized country giving finance to a developing country. We've got a developing country giving finance for a low carbon project in the UK. Does that matter? Is that just as valid? Should the Chinese be? I mean, they're also funding some railway between all the way to Burundi as well. So I mean, they're doing lots of these things. But how does this fit in this general climate finance? Is this something we should be welcoming or not?
Very interesting question. Thank you. Let's go to the back there. No, you, sir?
My name is Almo. I'm a student in UCL MG Institute, student as well of Professor Paul Atkins. So my question is this. What I get from you clearly is that the major stumbling block of reaching this holistic global agreement is that this effectiveness of this massive global summit. Has there been any idea put forward by anyone to actually divide this summit by blocks and lead by the majority of the countries, for example, when developing in that block, for example, in Asia Pacific, China and Japan should lead, and America, South and North, maybe United States and Brazil. So, and then the IPCC could play as a go-between to ensure that those leaders works, just to ensure that the other countries will follow suit if they reach agreement. What's your opinion?
Everyone has a lot of interest in the success of these negotiations, and by the way, well done for chairing so many so successfully. But until we get this sort of people power, we're not going to get a success, because politicians and bankers are ultimately just plumbing. They respond to policies that we as the people want. They invest in things that people are going to buy. I've seen the finance sector, which is where I'm from. There's an amazing amount of emphasis into green bonds, carbon trading desks. Investing in renewables. So I don't think that your experience is representative. But so how do we get the people more engaged, and how do we get the NGOs stop bothering the politicians and the banker bashing, because they are just the plumbing? How do we get them focused on getting the groundswell of people? And the other question was, what was the sticking point for the Philippines when they were perhaps less than constructive in the previous negotiations?
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Yes. David Wasdale from the Apollo Gaia project. This is a kind of step back for a moment. Even if your maybe turned into a yes and was successful, it seems to me that there are some very fundamental issues about what will then be being achieved, not just as a policy target, but as a solution to a problem. And I think it's faceted a little bit like this. The 2 degrees is a policy goal. We are seeing already severe impacts at 0.8 of a degree. It's a power series. Secondly, substituting transient climate response, as in the sum of the policymakers of the current AR5, for the full equilibrium response, means that we are downplaying the actual temperature increase. In other words, the commitment that is being put forward as the 2 degrees actually is more than 2 degrees in the current budget being set up. And thirdly, there's a very strong understanding developed that the Earth system sensitivity is about 2.5 times the standard sensitivity emerging from our computer models at the moment. And if that is applied as is being urged as the target, then 2 degrees is way above. And we should be looking at 5 degrees from the kind of commitments we're already trying to make. And we should be coming down below 2 degrees. The budget approach collapses there is no further budget available in terms of distribution of emissions pollutions, it collapses into a debt. And the target becomes not emissions reduction, but concentrations reduction, and severe concentrations reduction, if safety is to be maintained. So there's a huge issue, I think, in terms of even if the Navy becomes yes, what is the yes a yes to?
Okay. Well, I need to be at the airport at 7 tomorrow morning. Well, all of the things that you said on the science. One of the things that I'm probably least proud of in life is having been part of a risk assessment in relation to chemical substances transport by rail, and we were trying to define what was safe, and that means that you have to come up with probabilities, the number of deaths associated with the probability, which is in itself difficult enough. But then when you find there are so many people living in close proximity to the railway that it's not in line with your accepted risk assessment model, then you adjust the risk assessment model because you can't move out the people. In other words, I think that we are in this rather cynical situation where we are determining politically the boundaries of what is naturally acceptable on the basis of what is politically viable rather than on the basis of what is naturally necessary. And as I said, the 2 degrees is associated with, but you know all of this, 1/10 of a degree temperature increase per decade, which goes back to how quickly can trees move, how quickly can ecosystems adapt, how much sea level rise are you willing to... It's a political rationalization of natural necessity, and there's no way of explaining that or justifying it either. How do you get the politicians moving? Which is a sort of nasty abbreviation of your point. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't know who Paul Revere is? Come on, there must be somebody in the room who doesn't know who Paul Revere is. Okay. Paul Revere is extremely unpopular in this country, or he was at least a while ago, because he's the one that rode out and said, the British are coming, the British are coming. And then the Americans armed themselves and prevented the Brits from taking control of the United States again. And he had this really, he didn't get on his horse and say, the balance of evidence suggests that potentially the Brits could be on their way in either large or small numbers and could represent a significant or insignificant threat to American liberty. He just said the British are coming. So I think that goes back to the point about how do you keep the message simple. I think part of the way, part of the point is to simplify the message so that you can hold the politicians accountable, but then also have a message which is such that politicians, responsible politicians, want to be held accountable to it. And that goes to the point of finding balance. I mean, there is no point in industrialized countries massively reducing their emissions if it just means flight of capital and jobs to developing countries, and vice versa. So you need to have the balance between, well, you need to have something, you need to hold politicians accountable to something which you would want to be held accountable to yourself. I think that's part of the challenge. China isn't giving any finance to the UK. China is investing in a railway which they think is a really good business proposition. The Chinese are all over my home country, which is Holland, buying all of the technology which they don't have time to develop themselves. There used to be a time when if you made a top 10, not songs, but top 10 for wind, solar, and battery technology. If you made that top 10 years ago, then 7 out of 10 in each of those lists would be American companies. Now, there are hardly any American companies in that list. It's all companies from China, in some cases from India, from Brazil. In other words, the Chinese are investing in stuff which they think makes good business sense. And I think that they and others are, and this goes back to your point on investors, that they are seeing a real potential. And your point on the small group, actually, in every single climate change conference, at the end, it's a small group of countries that gets together and reforms, or takes the final decisions that need to be taken. It's very difficult to reform the system formally, because it's a system that operates by consensus, which means that you need everybody's agreement in order to change the rules. And there's always going to be somebody who feels that it's not to his or her advantage to change the rules. So it's better to have informal processes by which you change the rules. There's this wonderful, it's not wonderful at all, but there's this song in my country's language, which is all about a family that is, it's in the dead of winter, and they're with the family in a sleigh going through the snow, and there's music in the background, and they're all there in the sleigh, and then there's this pack of wolves that starts to get closer to the sleigh. So they know if they do nothing that the wolves are going to eat not only all of the horses but everyone that's in the sleigh. So they then get into this negotiation about which family member they're going to throw out first. And it sort of goes all the way until only one family member is left. That's not the way that you can do business in the UN. Everybody wants to stay in the sleigh right up until the end.
Okay, we are in fact going to call it an evening there. Thank you very much to Yvo. I don't have to tell you what a big